Many attempts have been made over the years to double the power of steam locomotives, resulting in some interesting and unusual designs. Garretts, Fairleys, and Malleys are just some of the ways engineers tried to get the power of 2 locomotives in one, but all of these come with their own drawbacks. Germany too was one such country to try and tackle this problem, but their solution to doubling an engine's power was to simply double the number of engines. By the 1880s, the adoption of narrow-gauge field railways by many European countries proved to be a massive boon for their armies, as it allowed troops, supplies, and heavy ammunition to be easily transported. The only issue was motive power. Since the rails were usually hastily laid on uneven ground, most conventional locomotives would derail, and so horses, donkeys, and mules were used to pull the wagons. Despite the rough conditions, a powerful locomotive capable of running on these tracks was still a very desirable prospect for most armies. The locomotives would need to be easy to repair, re-rail, refuel, lightweight, and work reliably, all while being flexible enough to tackle steep grades and sharp bends. A very tough set of criteria to meet. Many countries came up with their own designs, and by the 1890s, the armies of the German Empire found theirs. It was an idea patented in 1855 by Robert Stephenson and Company, but who originally proposed it to the German armies and when isn't well documented, but the idea was this: have a pair of 2 smaller tank engines coupled back to back. While at first this idea seems a bit daft, there were some genuine advantages to it. For starters, having 2 locomotives immediately means twice the power, and because they were coupled together in the middle, they could essentially articulate, allowing them to negotiate bends better than a fixed frame design. The total weight was also spread out between 2 locomotives, helping decrease axle load. Only 1 crew was needed to drive and fire both of them, with the controls of the front and rear engines being mirrored to make it easier for the driver to manage. When coupled together, the engines could be driven in both directions without issue, and should one engine break down, the other would still be able to keep working. Then there was the added bonus that the engines could be uncoupled and work as 2 separate machines, effectively doubling the amount of engines you have to work with while shunting. The first pair of these engines was built in the late 1880s by the Hohenzollern Locomotive Construction Company, but the most common design came from Krauss in 1890, these being 600mm gauge 060 engines, measuring at 8.2 meters long, 2.7 meters tall with 580mm driving wheels, a pair of 180 by 240mm cylinders, Stephenson valve gear, and a top speed of 20 km an hour. Despite being 2 separate locomotives, they were regarded as one unit, with both sharing the same number, the engines being individually distinguished by an A or B on their cabs. The A units had a slightly taller cab roof than the B units, allowing the cabs to overlap and provide better protection for the crew. The design was adopted by the Bavarian and Prussian Heeresfeldbahnen, and became known as Zwilling or twin locomotives. They were used by many parts of Germany's army, but their most noted use was in Germany's colony in southwest Africa. In 1897, the German Feldbahn Baukommando was tasked with building a line across the Namib Desert to connect Swakopmund to Windhoek. It was initially intended to be operated with mules and donkeys, but it didn't take long for steam power to be used, with the Zwillings being the ones to primarily run the line. Over 50 pairs were sent to southwest Africa, but it was here the engine's shortcomings were quickly found. Their bunkers and water tanks were found to be too small for long-distance work, meaning they had to stop and refill frequently. Special water tenders were built for them to use in Africa, which would be pulled behind the locomotives with a pipe connecting the tender to their water tanks. And while these did help improve the engine's range as well as provide seating for armed escorts, it was still a hassle that was unnecessary on many other engine designs. On top of that, it was found the engines were considerably underpowered for the work they were intended to do. Yes, doubling the engines does effectively double their power, but at the end of the day, adding another weak locomotive to the front of a train just leaves you with 2 weak locomotives. The Zwillings couldn't always be operated paired back to back on steeper lines either. If a grade was too steep, there was a risk of the water in the boiler of the rear engine flowing to the smokebox end and leaving the crown sheet exposed. As such, it's noted on some occasions that both engines needed to face the same way in order to safely climb hills, requiring more crew to operate the other engine. One can only imagine how uncomfortable the footplates would have been with no rear protection when running the engines split apart in illing formation in adverse weather. And to top it all off, drivers and firemen had to effectively look after 2 individual locomotives. Monitoring and maintaining the fire and speed of one locomotive is challenging enough, so crews needed to either work twice as hard or have an extra pair of hands to help them properly operate both machines. 182 pairs of locomotives had been built in Germany by 1914, though on the German Wikipedia it states that 454 double engines were made by this time. While the German army wasn't keen on the engines, the Japanese were, and from 1905 over 80 pairs of Zwillings were acquired for use by the Japanese army, with most of them coming second-hand from Africa after the railway was converted to Cape Gauge in 1913. They were used in the trench railways of the First World War by Germany, and some even ended up in the hands of Turkish state railways, but by then Germany had developed other locomotives such as the 8-wheeled brigade engines, which were simply more powerful and easier to use. The last of the Zwillings was built in 1905, and by 1920 most had been sold off for private use in factories and mines, including the ones sold to Japan. A handful of variations on the design were made by a few other manufacturers, but these never performed any better than the standard Krauss design. Out of all the Zwillings produced, only one has survived into preservation, this being number 154A, currently on display outside of Windhoek Station in Namibia. Considering the difficult conditions military engines needed to handle, the Zwillings were a very interesting solution to the problem. While it seems they were more than capable of traversing the rails as intended, their lack of range and power combined with how complex they were to operate together just made them more trouble than they were worth. It's a shame really, as they were such a unique idea that had some very useful benefits. Let them be a reminder then that, as effective as it is to double your power, you're more often than not doubling your problems too. Subscribe for more.